Hello and welcome to today's review for Ardor On Aros by Andrew J. Offutt, just like it says in the title and just like the cover art and the thumbnail shows. So this is an author I don't know much about. I recently picked up a different book by his Shadows of Hell. I was really excited for that because I had one a long time ago when I was a teenager. I remember loving it. I unfortunately got rid of it and now I got it again. For some reason, rather than going straight to rereading that one, I went to Ardor On Aros. That's another book that I got around about the same time by the same author. As far as I know, they're the only two books by him I've ever read. I don't remember any of his short stories. And while I liked Shadows of Hell, I loved Ardor On Aros so much that I have kept it for years. I have never gotten rid of it. First of all, let's look at that cover. I found a site on the internet that claims that wonderful snaky twirly thing around that's meant to be a frazetta. It could well be. If you look at the musculature, it's got a frazetta-y feel, certainly that very organic, very lush, I suppose, almost artwork is consistent with frazetta. I'm not sure it is, however. I couldn't find any mention of that on the novel. And rereading this was a joy. I really enjoyed this novel. I've said a few times that I don't really love quirky sci-fi. I don't really love humor sci-fi, but Ardor On Aros is an exception. There's nothing about it that isn't quirky. It is very tongue-in-cheek, very humorous, and it is essentially a bit of I'd say a spoof. It's definitely a send-up. He's definitely mocking other types of books. But first of all, here is my book, which I have had since I was a teenager. As you can imagine, there's a good reason why I downloaded the cover from the internet. According to the stamp here, it was acquired in Haifa, which is a Mediterranean port city. I was there sometime in the 80s. I might have bought this there. I don't remember visiting a second-hand bookshop, but let's face it, anywhere I go, I visit second-hand bookshops, so I probably did pick it up there. Anyway, I got into it. Oh, it's got green on the edges, on painted cover. I don't know what are those called when they paint the edges of the pages. Anyway, I got right into it and I was thoroughly enjoying it. And it wasn't until I started looking around to figure out who the cover art was by, that I discovered that teenage Deb, when the cover finally detached, carefully tucked it in behind. So I do actually have most of the cover for Ardor On Aros. I'm quite pleased about that. Usually, when I was younger, I think I mostly just threw away the covers, which was sad. So what is this? It's a funny book, and some people have called it a bit of a love letter as well as a send-up of the whole sword and planet genre. So Edgar Rice Burroughs is mentioned prominently in the beginning, and his Princess of Mars, his Pellucida books, his Tarzan of the Apes, all of these tough guy battle type things, but especially the ones on other planets. There's no doubt that the author is sending up that whole genre, but you wouldn't be able to send up this genre as well as he does unless you'd read it with great attention and great enjoyment. So I think it's fair to call it a bit of a love letter to the genre as well. Edgar Rice Burroughs is mentioned, so is Klein. Gerard Klein is an author that I recently read a book by, and apparently was one of the authors read that contributed to this novel. Neutz, I'm not sure who that, Netzel? Charles Netzel, maybe? Edward Bradbury as well. But basically, Pellucida and Edgar Rice Burroughs feature heavily in the first chapter, where we have our hero, Hank Ardor. He's just out of university. He calls it grad. And he's got a job with The Scientist Who Was Not Mad, which is the title of the first chapter. The chapter titles are enough to give away that this book in many ways doesn't take a lot seriously. The first chapter is The Scientist Who Was Not Mad. The second is The Planet That Was Not Mars. The third is The Man Who Was Not a Prince. And 4, The Girl I Did Not Rescue. So basically start off with Hank in this job in this scientist's lab, and he's talking to this research assistant, Evelyn Shea, who's writing a book, and she's basically writing an Edgar Rice Burroughs-esque type book. And this gives the author, through Hank, a great opportunity to rave a little bit about all the things that are and are not present in that particular style of adventure book. There's one particularly funny part, I think, where he talks about John Carter from John Carter of Mars, and how he keeps reminding the reader that he is the finest swordsman on 2 planets. And Offutt makes a point of making his protagonist, Hank, never having done sword at university. He doesn't know how to fight with a sword. And then Carter of Mars gets together with his princess, Dejah Thoris, who he keeps reminding everyone is the most beautiful woman on 2 planets. And then you've got a whole lot of this, him saving the girl chastely. Hank and Offutt have got a thing about how in all those particular types of adventures are essentially sexless. You've got these incredibly daring-do men who rescue princesses and treat them to the same sort of chivalry that's never really existed, but which a lot of Victorian and Edwardian books like pretending existed. Him and Evelyn Shea also make the point that these princesses keep on getting captured by the bad guys who never do anything naughty to them at all. And it's true. All these things about the Edgar Rice Burroughs types books are true. And they're a bit funny and they make them a bit dated. But for anyone who really loves the genre, that's just something you sort of laugh about a little bit and get on with. Until you read Offutt, where basically Hank, through an attempt to get into Evelyn Shea's pants, falls into the mysterious thing that's being investigated by her and by the professor who is not mad, and he ends up somewhere else where you have a lot of the traditional sort of things that you find from the Mars and Venus in these type of novels. You've got lesser gravity, so Hank's got the advantage of being able to bounce all over the place, and that becomes a plot feature. You've got 6-legged animals of burden that you can either ride or use as pack animals, and that I think they're bluey grey, or they're a strange colour. What do they call them? Slooks or snooks or something like that. And you've got a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Barsoom Mars. But as the story progresses, we find that it's more a sort of adventure that happens to someone like Hank, who isn't the best swordsman in 2 planets, and who isn't an amazing anything. He's just some really young guy, fresh out of what you guys call college and we call university, and he's a bit inept. He comes across a guy who's been wounded and is dying, and that's how he finds out that everyone on this planet has got telepathy. And the telepathy is used as a way to teach him the language of the planet. And he gets a bit nervous about the similarities between this planet and these mythical ones, and he can't explain it. At the end, an explanation is given. But while Edgar Rice Burroughs and his contemporaries made a big effort to explain why their adventure worked and why the site of their adventure makes sense, Offutt doesn't really bother to do that. He just seems to assume that any excuse for the planet being there is essentially an excuse. And while he does come up with a reason, which I'm not going to spoiler, at the end of the book, the explanation really comes through. And it's not an especially convincing one, but let's face it, no explanation for Pellucida or Barsoom or Mars is ever going to be in any way logical or satisfying. What Offutt does is what Offutt does well is that he gives you this explanation without really trying to convince you that it's real, and without ever really saying that he's convinced it's real. There's some pretty neat things about this book. There's a prologue, and the prologue is one of those ones where it basically claims, I don't know where this story came from, it appeared on my typewriter or my fax machine or whatever. I do know the name of the person involved, but only as a missing person. All disclaimers as to whether any of this is true or not. This is just the story as I have it. And that's a pretty cool thing. I think essentially what makes this book stand out from a lot of ones that are trying to be humorous is that the humor is tongue-in-cheek, it's integral, and it's loaded full of irony and pop references. Chick, what's wrong? Without ever trying to make you laugh on every page. This isn't an LOL book. This is a funny book, but it's funny because of the way he's spoofing or critiquing all these other genres. And that's a point that I think needs making. Unless you've read a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs, unless you're very familiar with the Barsooms and the Marses and all those antiquated adventure style, whether it's Pellucidar or Journey to the Center of the Earth, whatever it is, unless you're very familiar with that style, I don't think this book will really satisfy you. You may read it and you may enjoy it. Tell me if I'm wrong if you have. But essentially, this is a book to delight all those people, like myself, who have read dozens of Edgar Rice Burroughs and eventually start going, yeah, how many times can one princess get kidnapped and rescued by her faithful swain? How many times? All of that stuff is stuff that has been critiqued. Now, I did have someone comment about this book, based, I suspect, more on what the cover describes it as than the actual contents. The back cover says, what happens to a red-blooded young graduate looking for sex, fame and answers when he suddenly finds himself naked, frightened and several light years from home? A lot. A lot more than ever happened to Edgar Rice Burroughs as John Carter and Ulysses Paxton on Mars or Carson Napier on Venus. A lot more than anyone, least of all a red-blooded young graduate looking for sex, fame and answers ever dreamed of. Ardor On Aros. So Ardor is basically Hank's surname, and that's a thing that's meant to be funny. And of course it's a double entendre, but a lot of people seem to think this book is actually full of sex, and it really isn't. I suspect that anyone who's saying that hasn't bothered to read it. They read the back description. They maybe read a couple of chapters at the beginning where he's lusting and drooling after Evelyn Shea, the curvaceous research assistant. But for the rest of it, there isn't very much. It isn't what children on the internet these days call spicy, which just makes me think of black pepper and cloves. No, it's a mature adventure in that our protagonists aren't perfect and they're often inept. And Hank especially has got the ability to put his foot in his mouth and do entirely the wrong thing. And we get to see it from his hindsight. So when he insults not a princess, but in fact a witch, by not taking up her offer of sex, he doesn't realise that he's insulting a ritual and he isn't answering in a ritual fashion. But we realise that because he tells us all of this in hindsight. There's a lot of good stuff there. It's amusing. The world is lightly sketched but fun. It is a very, very character-driven book. Unlike, I'm going to say, Gerard Klein. I read one of his recently, what was it, The Day After Tomorrow? Something about tomorrow, the day before tomorrow, that's it. And it was good. But this has got a much more likeable, much more believable, and a much more dynamic characterization to it. Your main character is good. The bit characters that appear along the side are good. The dialogue is funny and humorous, and it lacks that stilted quality that, I'm going to say, 95% or higher of Edgar Rice Burroughs' dialogue was stilted. I still liked it. We'll probably go back and read it, especially Pellucidar and Journey to the Center of the Earth. They were my favourites. But Dialogue wasn't his strong point, whereas dialogue in Offutt's offering is excellent. So yeah, that's Ardor On Aros, a little bit of a niche, classic, sci-fi offering from 1973? Oh, apparently this is the first printing in the United States of America, 1973. It hasn't weathered well, but it has been well read. I read it on average once a year for quite a few years, and I'm delighted to finally got back to it. I thoroughly enjoyed this reread. So much so that I suspect I'm probably going to go on to another reread rather than onto a brand new book. Thank you for watching this rather rambling and totally disorganized video, yet another book review of classic science fiction fantasy. Have a great day and read good books.